In 1982, Clint Eastwood did something almost no one in Hollywood ever did. He offered Johnny Cash $1 million and meant every word. Cash listened, thought about it, and said no. It was 1982, and Clint Eastwood was at the peak of his power in Hollywood. Actor, director, icon. When Clint Eastwood wanted something, he usually got it. He had the clout, the money, and the vision to make things happen. And what Clint Eastwood wanted was Johnny Cash. Eastwood had invited Cash to his ranch outside of Carmel, California. It wasn't unusual. The two men had met a few times over the years at various Hollywood events. They respected each other from a distance. Both were men who'd built their careers on a certain image: tough, uncompromising, authentic in a business built on artifice. The invitation had been casual: dinner, some conversation, nothing formal. Cash had accepted, bringing June along. It seemed like a friendly evening between two legends. They ate dinner on Eastwood's patio overlooking the hills. Good food, good wine, easy conversation about music, movies, life. June and Clint's partner at the time made pleasant small talk. It was comfortable, relaxed. Then, after dinner, Eastwood asked Cash if they could talk privately. They walked out to the edge of the property. The sun was setting. The California hills rolled out in front of them, golden in the fading light. "John," Eastwood said, "I'm working on a film, a Western, and there's a role in it that I think you'd be perfect for." Cash looked at him, curious but cautious. "I appreciate that, Clint, but you know I'm not an actor." "You don't have to be," Eastwood said. "This role, it's basically you, an aging outlaw trying to make peace with his past. Rough, real, authentic. You wouldn't be playing a character. You'd just be yourself." Cash was quiet, listening. "I need you in this film," Eastwood continued, "and I'm willing to pay for it. Name your price." Cash smiled slightly. "Clint, I don't think you can afford me." Eastwood looked him in the eye. $1 million. Cash's smile faded. That was serious money. More money than most musicians saw for anything. More than Cash had made on some of his entire albums. "That's generous," Cash said carefully. "It's what you're worth, and it's what this film needs. Your presence, your authenticity. This role was written with you in mind, John. Nobody else can do it." Cash looked out at the hills. $1 million for a few weeks of work, for doing something that Eastwood was saying would just be being himself. It was tempting, not because Cash needed the money, but because it was validation from someone he respected. Clint Eastwood, one of the most successful actor-directors in Hollywood, was saying Cash belonged in his world. But something about it didn't sit right. "Clint," Cash said slowly, "I'm flattered, really, but I have to think about this." "Take your time," Eastwood said, "but I need an answer soon. We start shooting in 3 months. They walked back to the house. The rest of the evening was pleasant, but Cash was distracted. June could tell something was on his mind. On the drive back to their hotel, June asked, "What did Clint want to talk about?" Cash said, "He offered me a role in his new film, $1 million. June was quiet for a moment. "And I don't know if I should do it." "Why not?" Cash was silent, trying to articulate what he was feeling. "Because I'm not an actor, June. I'm a musician. And if I start doing movies, what does that make me? Am I Johnny Cash, the musician who sometimes acts? Or am I just another entertainer doing whatever pays?" June understood. "You're worried about your identity." "Yeah," said Cash. "I've spent my whole life being one thing, being clear about who I am. And I'm afraid if I start being other things, people won't know what's real anymore." Over the next few days, Cash thought about it. He talked to friends. Some said take the money. Some said it could be good for his career, exposure to a new audience, expand his legacy. But Cash kept coming back to the same question: who am I? He was Johnny Cash, the man in black, the voice for the forgotten, the guy who sang in prisons and meant it. That wasn't a character, that was him. And if he started playing characters in movies, would people believe the real Johnny Cash anymore? Or would they start to wonder if it had all been an act? A week later, Cash called Eastwood. "Clint," said Cash, "I've thought about your offer, and I have to say no." There was silence on the other end of the line. Then Eastwood said, "Can I ask why?" "Because I'm not an actor," Cash said. "I'm a musician, and I don't want to confuse the two." "John, you wouldn't be acting, you'd just be being myself," Cash interrupted gently. "Clint, that's the problem. If I become a character in your film, even a character based on me, people will start to wonder which version is real, the guy in the movie or the guy singing at the Grand Ole Opry, and I can't risk that. My music, my message, it only works if people believe it's real. If they think I'm just another actor playing a role, I lose that." Eastwood was quiet, processing this. "And there's something else," Cash continued. "If I become an actor, I stop being Johnny Cash the musician. I become Johnny Cash the entertainer who does music and movies. And I don't want that. I want to be one thing, one clear thing, a musician. That's my identity, and I can't dilute that." "Even for $1 million?" Eastwood asked. "Even for 10 million, Cash said. Because if people see me in a movie, they'll wonder if Johnny Cash the musician is real or just another character I'm playing. And Clint, I can't let that happen. My music is my truth. Acting would make it performance. I can't risk that." Eastwood was quiet for a long moment. Then he said something that surprised Cash. "That's why I wanted you," Eastwood said. "Because you know who you are. Most people in this business, they'll do anything if the price is right. They'll be whoever you want them to be. But you won't. You've drawn a line, and you won't cross it. That's rare, John, and it's admirable." "So you understand?" Cash asked. "I do," Eastwood said. "I wish you'd said yes. I think you'd have been perfect, but I respect your decision. You're protecting something that matters more than money. That takes guts." They talked for a few more minutes, cordially. Eastwood said he'd find someone else for the role. Cash wished him luck with the film. They hung up on good terms. But Cash sat there for a while after the call ended, thinking about what he'd just turned down. $1 million, a chance to work with Clint Eastwood, exposure to millions of people who might never listen to his music otherwise. June came into the room. "You told him no?" "Yeah," Cash said. "Any regrets?" He thought about it. "No, I made the right choice. I'm Johnny Cash the musician. That's who I am. That's who I want to be. And if I start being other things, I'll lose that. I'll become a brand instead of a person, and I can't let that happen." June smiled. "I'm proud of you. Even though I just turned down $1 million? Especially because you turned down $1 million, June said. You chose yourself over money. Most people can't do that." The film Eastwood was working on eventually got made. With a different actor in the role Eastwood had envisioned for Cash, it did well. Not a massive hit, but respectable. Critically acclaimed. And sometimes Cash would see it on TV and wonder what it would have been like if he'd said yes. But the wondering never lasted long, because he'd look at his guitar, or listen to one of his records, or read a letter from a fan who said his music had changed their life, and he'd remember why he'd said no. He was Johnny Cash, the musician, not Johnny Cash the actor, not Johnny Cash the brand, just Johnny Cash. And that clarity, that unwavering sense of identity, was worth more than any amount of money. Years later, in the late 1990s, Eastwood was doing an interview about his career. The interviewer asked him about near misses, roles he'd wanted certain actors for but couldn't get. "Johnny Cash," Eastwood said, without hesitation. "Early 80s. I had a role that was perfect for him, offered him a lot of money. He turned me down." "Why?" Eastwood smiled. "Because he knew who he was, and he wasn't willing to compromise that for anything. Not for money, not for fame, not for anything. He was Johnny Cash, the musician, and that was all he wanted to be. Did you respect that decision? Absolutely, Eastwood said. In fact, I respected him more after he said no than I would have if he'd said yes, because it showed he had principles. He had a line he wouldn't cross. And at Hollywood, that's incredibly rare. Most people will do anything if the price is right, but Cash wouldn't. He knew what mattered, and he protected it. Do you think he was right to turn it down? Eastwood thought about it. For him, absolutely. Because if Johnny Cash had become an actor, he would have stopped being Johnny Cash the way people knew him. The authenticity that made him special would have been diluted, and he understood that better than I did. I was thinking about what would be good for my film. He was thinking about what would be good for his legacy, and he was right. The story of Johnny Cash turning down Clint Eastwood's million-dollar movie offer never became widely known during Cash's lifetime. Cash didn't talk about it, didn't brag about it. It was just a decision he'd made, one of many over his long career. But the people close to him knew about it, and they understood what it meant, that Johnny Cash wasn't for sale, that his identity as a musician wasn't something he was willing to compromise, that he'd rather be broke and authentic than rich and deluded. A lot of people say they have principles, June Carter Cash once said in an interview, but John actually lived them. He was offered huge amounts of money to do things that would have compromised who he was, and he always said no. Not because he didn't want the money, but because he wanted to be Johnny Cash more than he wanted anything else. Can you give an example? June smiled. Clint Eastwood offered him $1 million to be in a movie. John turned it down, and when I asked him why, he said, "Because I'm a musician, and if I become an actor, people won't know what's real anymore." That's who John was, someone who knew himself so completely that no amount of money could betray that. The interviewer pressed further. Was there ever a moment when he questioned that decision, when he wondered if he'd made a mistake? June shook her head. Not that I ever saw. And I would have known. John and I talked about everything. But that decision, turning down Clint's offer, he never second-guessed it. In fact, years later, when other directors approached him with similar offers, he'd tell them the same thing. I'm a musician. That's all I am. That's all I want to be. And he meant it. Some people thought he was being stubborn or leaving money on the table. But John saw it differently. He saw every opportunity to dilute his identity as a threat to what he'd built. And he was right to see it that way. What do you think would have happened if he'd said yes, if he'd done the film? June considered the question carefully. I think he would have been good in it. Clint was right. John had a natural presence, a gravitas. He could have been a successful actor. But here's what people don't understand. Being successful at something doesn't mean you should do it. John was successful as a musician because that's where his truth lived. His songs came from real pain, real faith, real experience. If he'd started acting, people would have started wondering where the truth ended and the performance began. And once that doubt enters people's minds, you can't remove it. John understood that. So he protected his truth, even when it cost him $1 million. Johnny Cash died in 2003, having lived his entire life as exactly one thing, a musician. He never appeared in a major motion picture, never tried to expand his brand beyond music, never compromised his identity for money or fame or anything else. And because of that, when people think of Johnny Cash, they think of one clear image, the man in black, the voice for the forgotten, the guy who sang in prisons and meant every word. Not an actor playing a role, not a brand, not a commodity, just Johnny Cash, the musician. That clarity, that unwavering commitment to being one thing and being it completely, was what made him legendary. Not despite turning down opportunities like Eastwood's film, but because of it. Because Johnny Cash understood something that most people never learn, that being everything to everyone means being nothing to anyone. That true power comes from knowing who you are and refusing to be anything else. Clint Eastwood offered Johnny Cash $1 million to be in a movie, and Johnny Cash said no. Not because he didn't respect Eastwood, not because he didn't want the money, but because he respected himself more. And that decision, that refusal to dilute his identity for any price, was worth more than any role in any film could ever be. Because Johnny Cash wasn't an actor, he was a musician, and that was enough.